All right, guys, we are talking about key issue 2 of chapter 7 today. The main thing that we have to talk about, I will say this one's going to get a little bit long. It's only about 5 pages, but we've got a lot of information to cover. So the first thing is migration of African Americans. Obviously, originally they were just Africans, and it was forced migration, right? Because we're talking about the triangular slave trade. They had to come to the United States, and they worked as slaves in the American South. This is what we talked about in key issue 1. So the triangular slave trade is this right here, okay? It's ships leave Europe for Africa with cloth and other goods used to buy the slaves. Then they transported the slaves and gold from Africa to the Western Hemisphere, primarily to the Caribbean islands. To complete the triangle, the same ships then carried sugar and molasses from the Caribbean on their return trip to Europe, okay? So this basically, they would drop the slaves off in either South America or in North America. They would use them to get the things that they needed, and then they would ship those things that they needed off to Europe. Europe would go back to Africa, et cetera, so on to complete the triangle. Okay, so that was forced migration. They had to go. They didn't have a choice. Okay, however, we have voluntary migration from Latin America and from Asia. This is what we talked about in the migration chapter. This is also what we talked about in key issue 1, voluntary migration. They chose to come here because they wanted better economic opportunities. Okay, that's why they live in the urban areas, so that they can get the better jobs, because that's where the jobs are located. Okay, so as I said earlier in the key issue 1, Hispanics, 63% of them are going to come from Mexico, about 10% are going to come from Puerto Rico, about 4% from Cuba, et cetera, so on, right? That's what this says. From Asia, it's a much more even distribution. We've got about 21%, 22% from China, we've got about 20% from the Philippines, we've got 18, whatever, blah, 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 okay? So that's the important thing that you need to get out of this, is that African Americans are here because of forced migration, whereas Asian Americans and Latin Americans are here because of voluntary migration. Okay, so then we start looking at inter-regional migration. So people, primarily African Americans, leaving the South and trying to go to other places. So after the Civil War ended, African Americans got their 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment. They got the right to vote. They got citizenship. They got their freedom. Right? Those are the 3 things that they wanted, and it was great, except that it wasn't. Okay, because some things still sort of existed. So things like sharecropping. Basically what would happen here is the owner of the land would go up to the slave and they'd be like, okay, you're no longer a slave, but I still need somebody to work for me. And so it'd be great if you would do that. Okay. Also, because you're no longer my property, in order for you to work here and have a place to stay, I need to charge you rent. So basically I will charge you $100 in rent a year and I'll only pay you $80 to work the field all year. So at that point, that person is coming out at net negative $20 every year. Okay, so they'll never be able to leave. So even though they're no longer slaves, they're still technically slaves, right? There's no way that they can ever get out from working the jobs that they're working. Okay, that's also the reason that so many of them stayed in the South for as long as they did. The only reason they left is when those people didn't need those jobs being done by humans anymore, and they could start having them done mechanically. And so we start seeing African Americans leave the South, go to the West, they go north, they go to the Northeast, et cetera, okay? But then we also have intra-regional migration. Okay, so basically the way that we see this is through the expansion of the ghettos. Okay, so if we say Baltimore's West Side African American ghetto expanded from 3 square kilometers to 25 square kilometers. Okay, so that means that it got like almost 8 times as large. And so what that's going to do is, and I'm going to warn you guys, this area of the book gets extremely racist. So basically what happens is those ghettos are expanding, and the reason that that's able to happen is because white people got afraid that eventually the black people would come over into their neighborhoods. And so that started what they called white flight. Okay, and so white people are leaving to try to get out before their property values drop or before they have to deal with consequences of being around people who aren't white. Okay, so since we had since we had realtors who understood this, they started using what they called blockbusting, which is basically realtors would go up to white people and they'd say, hey, I heard that they're about to expand the ghetto, that there's about to be black people living in your neighborhood. You should sell now, and you should sell to me for a lot less than this house is worth. And the white people would be afraid because they would think that the prices would drop even more, and they would sell it. And then the realtor would then hike the price back up and then sell it to black people so that they could buy more cheap white houses and sell them for more expensive to black people. And it was really, really, truly terrible. Okay, so that's white flight. That's blockbusting. Blockbusting is super illegal, but that didn't stop people from doing it. Just like separate but equal. Okay. I will tell you that separate but equal is one of the Supreme Court decisions that makes the least sense when you look back on it. Okay, originally there was Plessy versus Ferguson. This guy Plessy, he decides that he's going to sit on a train car. He is half black, half white. He looks pretty white, so he sits in the white car. All right, nobody cares, nobody says anything, nobody notices that he's not white. Then when he eventually says that he's black, they're like, okay, you've got to go sit in the black car. He says, I'm not going to do that. They say, okay, you're arrested. So they arrest him, they take him away. Okay, then it goes to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court says that as long as the cars are equal, it does not matter that the people are being kept separate. Okay, so this doctrine gets applied to everything, to schools, to water fountains, to everything. So you could have two separate water fountains as long as they're separate but equal. Okay, does this water fountain look like the equivalent of this water fountain? Probably not. All right, which is going to lead us into the fact that separate is inherently unequal, and we'll get to that. Okay, but segregation continues to exist through the American South. They've got Jim Crow laws, which are basically things that are created to keep black people down. They're called that because there was a white actor who was really, really good, and I say good with quotation marks because there's nothing good about it, but he was really good at playing a black character in plays and stuff. And so in order to play that black character, he would have to put black shoe polish on his face, and they called it acting in blackface. So they called these laws Jim Crow laws because he was such a great actor when he acted black. And so these are just other ways that African Americans are being kept down in the United States during this time. And they had all this segregation. So while all of this is happening in the United States, we've got the same thing happening in South Africa. Except in South Africa, instead of calling it segregation, they called it apartheid. All right, and we are going to talk more about apartheid on Friday, so I'm not going to spend a ton of time talking about it. You guys are more than welcome to talk about apartheid for your project, and then that is all I really needed to talk to you guys about that. So as long as you guys know the patterns of migration of African Americans within the United States, and you know the laws that were once used to segregate the races in the United States and South Africa, then you guys will be just fine on this chapter.